Kuminga, long pass. They may have a shot. He threw it in.
Goodness.
It goes in for Jonathan Kuminga.
Oh. By 7.
Look how high Jonathan Kuminga gets. Oh my.
Somewhere in Los Angeles right now, there is a phone call happening that could reshape the entire future of one of the most famous teams in basketball history. On one end, a front office desperate to fill a hole that just opened up in their roster. On the other end, a young player who has already been traded once this year, cut loose by a team that gave up on him twice. And caught in the middle of it all is a question nobody expected to be asking this summer. Could Jonathan Kuminga really end up wearing purple and gold? If you follow basketball even a little bit, you already know this name has been everywhere the last few weeks. But most people only know half the story. They know the rumors. They know the mock trades. They know the headlines screaming that the Lakers are chasing him. What most people do not know is everything that happened before this moment. The years of frustration. The benching. The trade that nobody saw coming. The fresh start that turned into something special. And the strange twist of fate that has now placed him right at the center of the biggest offseason shakeup in Lakers history. So let's slow down. Let's go back to the beginning and walk through this story step by step, because by the end of it, you will understand exactly why this single decision could define the next chapter of the Los Angeles Lakers. Picture the last few years of this young man's career like a roller coaster with no seatbelt. 1 year he is a champion before he even turns 20. A few years later he is sitting at the end of a bench, wondering if the league has already given up on him. Then, out of nowhere, a trade flips everything upside down, and suddenly he looks like a completely different player. And now, right when things finally seemed settled, his entire future is up in the air again, dangling in front of one of the most storied franchises in basketball. This is not just a trade rumor. This is a story about second chances, about what happens when talent finally meets opportunity, and about a franchise trying to figure out who it even is anymore after losing the player who defined it for almost a decade. To understand why this moment matters so much, you cannot just look at the last few weeks of headlines. You have to go all the way back to where this journey actually began. It starts back in 2021. The Golden State Warriors were still one of the most powerful teams in basketball, built around a core that had already won multiple championships together. But even great teams know they cannot last forever. So that year, on draft night, Golden State made a bet on the future. With the 7th overall pick, they selected a raw, athletic, incredibly gifted young forward out of the DRC-born, New York-raised basketball scene. His name was Jonathan Kuminga. He was not brought in to be a role player. He was brought in as part of what the front office proudly called their 2 timelines plan. The idea was simple on paper. Keep the championship window open with the veterans, while quietly building a second core of young talent underneath them, so that when the stars eventually faded, the next generation would already be ready to take over. Kuminga was supposed to be the centerpiece of that second timeline. A do-it-all forward with size, speed, and the kind of upside that made scouts excited every time he stepped on the floor. Watching him back then, you could see exactly why teams fell in love with him. He had the kind of frame that made grown men look small standing next to him, but he moved like a guard, gliding through open space, exploding toward the rim with a burst that most players his size simply do not have. Coaches talked about his motor. Scouts talked about his ceiling. Everyone agreed on one thing. If it all came together, he could become the kind of do-everything forward that changes a franchise for a decade. The only question anyone seemed to have was timing. Would he get the runway he needed to grow, or would he be stuck behind players who were already established stars, forced to fight for every single minute just to prove he belonged? And for a little while, it looked like the plan was working. As a rookie, he showed flashes. Enough athleticism to finish above the rim, enough defensive potential to guard multiple positions, enough raw talent that everyone around the league started to take notice. In his very first season with the team, Golden State went on to win a championship, and Kuminga got to experience something most young players only dream about. He was a champion before he had even fully found his footing in the league. But here is the thing about being drafted onto a team that is still trying to win right now. Playing time is never guaranteed. Every single minute has to be earned, and it has to be earned in front of a demanding coaching staff, a veteran locker room, and an entire fan base that expects trophies, not development projects. Season after season, Kuminga kept improving on paper. His scoring numbers climbed. His rebounding numbers climbed. There were nights where he looked like the exact player Golden State hoped he would become. But there were also long stretches where he simply could not find consistent minutes, buried behind established veterans who had already proven themselves on the biggest stages in the sport. Then the front office made a move that would change everything for Kuminga, even though it had nothing to do with him directly. Golden State brought in a new star. A proven, battle-tested scorer who instantly became a focal point of the offense. And when a team adds a player like that, something has to give. Minutes that used to belong to the young forward slowly started disappearing. What had once been over 25 minutes a night began shrinking down toward 20, then even lower on some nights. The path forward that once looked so clear had suddenly become crowded, and Kuminga found himself fighting just to stay relevant on his own team. Imagine spending your entire career being told to be patient, to trust the process, to keep working, and then watching the team hand meaningful chunks of your role over to someone else, all while the front office insists everything is fine. That is the environment Kuminga found himself living in. Every game became a puzzle. Would he get real minutes tonight, or would he watch most of the fourth quarter from the bench in a suit and tie mentality even while wearing his jersey? Every stretch of good play felt temporary, like it could vanish the moment the rotation shifted again. For a young player still trying to build confidence and rhythm, that kind of uncertainty is exhausting. It chips away at you, game after game, until frustration starts to feel like the only honest reaction left. The frustration boiled over during a tense offseason. Kuminga became a restricted free agent, which in basketball terms means his current team had the power to match any offer he received from another club. It sounds like a strong position to be in, but for a player who desperately wanted a fresh start and a real opportunity to prove himself somewhere else, it became a trap. Reports at the time described a young man who wanted out, quietly hoping some other franchise would sweep in with an offer that Golden State either could not or would not match. But no rescue ever came. Instead, after a long and uncomfortable standoff that dragged deep into the offseason, he ended up re-signing with the very team he had hoped to leave behind, on a short 2-year deal. Think about how uncomfortable that must have felt walking back into the facility that fall. Everyone in that building knew the summer story. The player who wanted to leave, staying anyway, because no better option ever materialized. The front office that had been publicly hesitant about his future, now forced to welcome him back into the fold. There is no version of that situation that feels like a fresh start. It feels like two people who almost broke up, deciding to stay together out of circumstance rather than genuine excitement about the future. You could feel the tension the moment the new season started. This was not a happy reunion. This was two sides stuck together, neither one fully trusting the other. And it did not take long for the cracks to show again. Kuminga actually started the year with some promise, showing signs of the player everyone once believed he could become. But within a couple of months, the same old pattern returned. His playing time shrank. He found himself out of the rotation entirely on some nights, watching from the bench in a uniform he no longer felt like he belonged in. Behind the scenes, tension had been building between Kuminga and his head coach for years, and reports later revealed that things had reached a breaking point. There was a private meeting in December where the coach addressed Kuminga's frustration directly, acknowledging that the situation clearly was not working. It was one of those quiet, behind-closed-doors conversations that never gets filmed, never gets a highlight reel, but ends up meaning everything, because it set the wheels in motion for what came next. By the time January rolled around, Kuminga had played in only a couple of games for his original team that entire calendar year. Think about that for a second. A former lottery pick. A player once viewed as a foundational piece of a franchise's future. Reduced to watching from the sideline, buried so deep in the rotation that his name barely came up in the box score anymore. And then, just to make things even more painful, he suffered a knee injury that sidelined him for several more games right as trade rumors were swirling harder than ever. Everyone around the league could feel it coming. This was not a question of if a trade would happen anymore. It was only a question of where. Trade deadline day in the NBA has a rhythm all its own. Phones buzzing in war rooms across the league. Reporters camped out, refreshing their feeds every few seconds. Front office executives making calls they have been quietly setting up for weeks, sometimes months, waiting for the exact right moment to pull the trigger. For Kuminga, that entire day must have felt like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing a decision about his career and his future was being made in conference rooms he was not even in the room for. And then, on a Wednesday night in early February, the news broke. Golden State had agreed to send Jonathan Kuminga, along with a veteran guard, to the Atlanta Hawks. In exchange, they were bringing back a skilled big man to fill the hole they had at center. It was framed by almost everyone covering the deal the exact same way. This was a breakup years in the making. Both sides needed it. The young forward finally got what he had been asking for since that uncomfortable free agency summer. A brand new environment. A brand new coaching staff. A brand new chance to prove that all those flashes of talent were not just wasted potential. There is something almost poetic about how quickly things changed once he got there. He was still nursing that knee injury, so his actual Hawks debut had to wait a little while. But the moment he stepped onto the floor for Atlanta, something was different. Instead of fighting for scraps of playing time behind a crowded depth chart, he was thrown directly into the starting lineup. The team had some injuries of its own at the time, which opened the door even wider, but Kuminga did not just walk through that door, he sprinted through it. Game after game, you could see a completely different player than the one who had been fading into irrelevance just weeks earlier. He was scoring with confidence. He was attacking the basket like a man who finally felt free. He was grabbing rebounds, making plays, doing all the things that had once made scouts fall in love with him back on draft night. It was as if a switch had flipped. The same skills that had been buried under years of frustration in Golden State were suddenly on full display under the bright lights of a new city. Think about how strange that is. Nothing about his physical ability had changed overnight. He did not suddenly get faster or stronger or more skilled in the span of a few weeks. What changed was trust. What changed was opportunity. A new coaching staff looked at him and saw a piece they needed, not a project they were still deciding whether to invest in. And when a talented young athlete finally gets that kind of belief, you often see exactly what happened here. A player who looks almost unrecognizable from the version everyone thought they knew. Teammates started feeding him the ball in space. Coaches started drawing up plays that put him in position to attack instead of just filling gaps in a crowded rotation. For the first time in years, Kuminga was not just surviving on a roster. He was being built around. There was one especially symbolic moment that basketball fans could not stop talking about. Weeks after the trade, Atlanta was scheduled to face Golden State for the very first time since the deal. Imagine that walk into the arena. Facing the very franchise that drafted you, developed you, won a championship with you, and then decided you were expendable. It was the kind of storyline that writes itself. A young player who had once felt invisible on one bench now getting his chance to shine directly in front of his old team. As the season wound down, the new version of Kuminga kept building. Over his final stretch of games in a Hawks uniform, he was putting up solid, respectable numbers as a starter, showing flashes of exactly the two-way forward the league had been waiting to see since he was drafted. For the first time in years, it felt like his career had real momentum again. But basketball, especially the business side of it, rarely lets a good story stay simple for long. As the offseason arrived, Atlanta had a decision to make. Kuminga's contract included a team option for the following season, meaning the Hawks could choose to keep him under contract at a set price, or they could let that option expire and allow him to hit the open market. And in a move that stunned plenty of fans who had just watched him thrive down the stretch, Atlanta chose to decline that option. Just months after acquiring him and watching him find new life on their roster, the Hawks decided to move on, cutting him loose into unrestricted free agency. Now, before you assume this was some brutal rejection, it is worth understanding the business reasons behind it. Atlanta had been busy building out its roster that summer, adding new pieces and locking up other players to bigger commitments. With a roster that was suddenly full and limited financial flexibility left over, keeping Kuminga at that specific option price no longer made sense for where the franchise was headed. It was not necessarily a statement about his talent. It was a business decision, The kind that happens in professional sports more often than fans realize. But here is where it gets interesting. Even though Atlanta declined that option, they had not simply washed their hands of him completely. League insiders quickly pointed out that the Hawks were unlikely to just let him walk away and get absolutely nothing in return. The far more likely path, according to people close to the situation, was something called a sign and trade. In simple terms, that means Atlanta would agree to sign Kuminga to a new contract, and then immediately trade both him and that contract to another team, in exchange for something of value coming back the other way. It lets the player choose exactly where he wants to go and exactly how much money he wants to make, while still giving his previous team something to show for letting him leave. And that brings us to the second half of the story. Because while all of this was happening with Kuminga in Atlanta, something enormous was unfolding a few thousand miles away, inside the walls of the Los Angeles Lakers. For nearly a decade, the Lakers had built their entire identity around one single superstar. A player whose name alone could sell out arenas around the world. He had led them to a championship, mentored young players, carried the franchise through some incredibly difficult seasons, and become as synonymous with the purple and gold as almost any player in franchise history. But nothing lasts forever in professional sports, no matter how legendary the resume. This offseason, that superstar made the decision that fans had quietly feared for years but never truly wanted to imagine. He informed the organization that he would not be returning for the upcoming season, closing the book on an 8-year run with the franchise. It was the end of an entire era. Not just the loss of a great player, but the loss of the very foundation the Lakers had been building around for almost a decade. Try to imagine what that news must have felt like inside the Lakers organization. For 8 years, entire seasons had been planned around this one player. Coaching decisions, roster construction, even marketing campaigns all revolved around him. Young players who joined the team during that stretch grew up watching him before they ever shared a locker room with him. And now, all at once, that chapter was simply over. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no long goodbye season built around celebrating his legacy game by game. It happened the way a lot of major changes in professional sports happen. Quietly, suddenly, and then the entire league is left adjusting to a completely different landscape almost overnight. Suddenly, the front office found itself in an unfamiliar position. They still had another genuine superstar on the roster, a dazzling, do-it-all playmaker who had already shown flashes of brilliance since arriving in Los Angeles. The plan quickly became clear. Instead of mourning the departure of one era, the Lakers would pivot immediately, building an entirely new team identity around this new franchise cornerstone. But building a contender around a single star takes more than just talent at the top. It takes depth. It takes the right complementary pieces. And that is exactly where the Lakers ran into trouble. Making matters worse, the roster took another hit that same offseason when a key rotation forward, a reliable three-point shooter who had provided valuable minutes and playoff experience, departed in free agency as well. Between the superstar's departure and the loss of that veteran forward, the Lakers suddenly found themselves alarmingly thin at the forward position, exactly the spot on the floor where modern basketball demands versatile, athletic players who can defend multiple positions and space the floor at the same time. So there they were. A franchise with championship expectations, a brand new superstar to build around, and a glaring hole in the roster that needed to be filled immediately. And that is precisely when Jonathan Kuminga's name started coming up in Lakers conversations. It made a strange kind of sense the moment people thought about it. Here was a talented, athletic, 23-year-old forward, exactly the archetype the Lakers desperately needed, freshly available on the open market after finally breaking through and finding his footing during that stretch in Atlanta. The timing lined up almost too perfectly. A team with a hole at forward. A player at exactly that position looking for his next home. A front office motivated to make a splash after losing their franchise icon. It felt to many people around the league like fate nudging two sides toward each other. Reports quickly confirmed that the interest was very real. Multiple insiders close to the situation described Kuminga as remaining high on the Lakers' radar throughout the summer, with mutual interest reportedly building on both sides even before the ink had dried on the announcement that the franchise legend would not be returning. It seemed like the perfect story. Grizzled franchise searching for a new identity meets talented young players searching for a real opportunity to prove himself on a bigger stage. But here is where the excitement runs directly into reality, because acquiring Kuminga was never going to be as simple as just signing him. Since Atlanta had already declined his option and he was now heading toward unrestricted free agency, the Lakers could not simply trade for him using a normal trade like teams typically do during the season. Instead, they needed to pull off that complicated maneuver mentioned earlier, a sign and trade. That means Atlanta would first need to agree to sign Kuminga to a brand new contract on their end, and only then agree to send him and that contract over to Los Angeles in exchange for something valuable coming back. It sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it requires two separate teams, two separate sets of motivations, and often a third team thrown into the mix just to make the money work out under the league's complicated salary rules. And that is exactly what analysts and mock trade artists across the internet started trying to solve. Proposal after proposal started popping up, imagining creative ways to bring this deal together. Some versions involved a three-team structure with the Chicago Bulls getting pulled into the mix. Other versions imagined a different three-team framework involving the Milwaukee Bucks, sending draft compensation and other assets flowing in different directions to satisfy every team involved. One particularly detailed proposal envisioned Kuminga signing a 4-year contract worth somewhere around $85 million, structured so that his salary would be highest in the very first season and gradually decrease over the following years. A common trick teams use to help manage their future salary cap flexibility. It all sounded exciting on paper. Fans could already picture it. A rebuilt Lakers roster, featuring their brilliant new franchise playmaker running the offense, flanked by an athletic, high-energy forward who finally looked like the player everyone had projected him to be back on draft night all those years ago. Highlight reels were already being imagined. Alley-oops. Fast break finishes. A defense that could finally switch across multiple positions the way modern basketball demands. Think about what that pairing could actually look like on the floor. A brilliant, crafty playmaker who can see passing lanes most players do not even know exist, paired with a forward who runs the floor like a sprinter and finishes above the rim with ease. One player controls the tempo and draws every defender's attention with his scoring gravity. The other player fills the open spaces left behind, cutting, running, and cleaning up everything the defense cannot account for. On paper, it is the kind of partnership that makes offensive coordinators smile and opposing defensive coaches lose sleep. A modern NBA roster needs exactly this kind of balance, a steady hand controlling the game paired with an athletic finisher who can turn a broken play into an easy 2 points in the blink of an eye. And it is not just about scoring. Defensively, a long, athletic forward like Kuminga gives a team the versatility to switch across multiple positions without completely falling apart on that end of the floor. In today's league, where lineups constantly shift and offenses look for any mismatch they can exploit, having a player who can guard smaller, quicker players on the perimeter and still hold his own against bigger forwards inside is an enormous asset. It is exactly the kind of two-way skill set that title-contending rosters are built around. But real negotiations rarely move as smoothly as mock trades on the internet. As the summer dragged on, cracks started to appear in the optimism. Analysts covering the situation closely began cautioning fans not to get too far ahead of themselves. One well-respected league insider specifically warned that the Lakers needed to carefully balance Kuminga's exciting upside against the sheer size of the financial commitment it would take to actually bring him in. This was not going to be a bargain deal. Whoever signed him was likely to be committing tens of millions of dollars, spread across multiple seasons, to a player who, despite his recent hot stretch in Atlanta, still had not proven himself over a full, sustained season as a featured piece on a winning team. And then came the reports that really cooled things down. According to multiple sources close to the negotiations, talks between the Lakers and the Hawks had stalled significantly. The two sides were described as being far apart on the actual terms of any potential deal, with Los Angeles reportedly hesitant to give up meaningful draft capital just to facilitate a sign and trade for a player who, while talented, still came with real questions attached. Atlanta, on the other side of the table, seemed unwilling to simply hand him over for pennies on the dollar after watching him find real success wearing their jersey. It is a classic standoff in professional sports. One side believes they are giving up more value than they are getting back. The other side believes the exact same thing about themselves. And until one side blinks, or a third team steps in to sweeten the pot enough to make everyone comfortable, the whole deal simply sits there, stuck in limbo, generating headlines but producing no actual resolution. There is also a quieter complication sitting underneath all of this. Atlanta had just added another proven veteran wing to their own roster that same offseason, filling out their depth chart and leaving them with less financial room to maneuver than they had earlier in the summer. A roster with fewer easy exits and less flexibility to absorb salary makes negotiations even trickier, because now every proposed trade has to satisfy a much narrower set of financial rules on Atlanta's side, while still convincing Los Angeles that the price being asked is fair. It is the kind of behind-the-scenes detail that never shows up in a highlight reel, but it can slow down or completely derail a deal just as easily as any disagreement over draft picks. Meanwhile, every single day that this standoff continues, the pressure quietly builds on both sides. Free agency does not wait forever. Other teams around the league are watching this situation just as closely as the Lakers are, and if talks stay frozen for too long, there is always a chance another franchise swoops in with an offer that changes the entire equation. Sometimes a stalemate like this resolves itself calmly over a period of weeks. Other times, it takes a sudden, unexpected jolt, a change in circumstances, a shift in leverage, or simply one side deciding they cannot afford to wait any longer before it finally breaks in one direction or the other. So where does that leave us right now, in this very moment? The Lakers are a franchise in transition, trying to figure out their new identity after the departure of the player who defined an entire era of their history. They have a brilliant new superstar to build around, but a roster with real holes, especially at forward, that desperately needs fixing before the new season begins. Jonathan Kuminga sits right in the middle of it all, a talented 23-year-old who spent years fighting for playing time on a stacked roster, finally found his rhythm after a mid-season trade nobody saw coming, and is now the subject of one of the most talked about free agency sagas of the entire summer. Will the Lakers eventually find a way to bridge the gap and complete a sign and trade that brings him to Los Angeles? Will Atlanta hold firm and either extract a much bigger return, or simply let him walk elsewhere to a different suitor entirely? Will some other team nobody is even talking about right now swoop in with an offer that changes everything overnight? Nobody, not even the people directly involved in these negotiations, can say for certain how this ends. What we do know is this. Basketball has a strange way of rewarding patience, and it also has a strange way of punishing certainty. A few months ago, Jonathan Kuminga was buried on a bench in Golden State, watching his once promising career slip away in real time. A trade deadline decision changed all of that, giving him a fresh start he desperately needed. Now, that same fresh start has turned him into one of the most sought-after names of an entire offseason, with one of the most iconic franchises in the sport actively working to bring him aboard. Careers in professional sports rarely follow a straight line. They twist, they stall, they collapse, and then sometimes, against every expectation, they rebuild themselves into something nobody saw coming. Jonathan Kuminga's story over these past few months is a perfect example of exactly that kind of turn. From afterthought in Golden State, to breakout piece in Atlanta, to potential centerpiece of a brand new era in Los Angeles. The next move in this saga could come at any moment. A phone call between front offices. A shift in contract demands. A third team suddenly entering the picture with an offer nobody expected. Free agency sagas like this one can stay frozen for weeks, and then resolve themselves in a single afternoon once the right pieces finally line up. So keep your eyes on this one, because whichever way it breaks, it is going to say something important about where the Los Angeles Lakers are headed next, in the very first chapter of their story without the legend who built the last one. And if this is the beginning of a new Lakers era built around a completely different identity, then the decision on Jonathan Kuminga might end up being remembered as the very first domino that fell the moment a storied franchise either found its next great piece, or watched him walk right past them into somebody else's future. Think back to where this story started. A 7th overall pick, drafted into a golden window that was never really built for him. Years of hoping for a chance that kept slipping just out of reach. A trade that felt, at the time, like a quiet ending to a disappointing chapter. And then, almost overnight, a fresh start that turned into the best basketball of his career. Every single step of that journey looked like a small, forgettable event on its own. A missed rotation spot here. An injury there. A single trade deadline decision buried under 100 other headlines that same night. But stacked together, all of those small moments built the exact set of circumstances that now has one of the most famous franchises in basketball history sitting across the table, trying to figure out how to bring him home. That is what makes stories like this one so compelling to follow. Nobody plans a career path like this. Nobody sits down on draft night and predicts a mid-season trade, a stalled sign and trade negotiation, and a franchise-altering superstar departure all colliding together to create one single opportunity. It happens through a series of decisions, some made by front offices, some made by coaches, some made by the player himself, each one nudging the story forward until it arrives somewhere nobody could have fully predicted. So here is where we stand. A talented young forward, finally playing his best basketball at exactly the moment his contract situation makes him available. A historic franchise, staring down its first season in nearly a decade without the player who defined it, desperately searching for pieces to build something new. And a negotiation that, as of right now, remains stuck, unresolved, and completely capable of breaking in either direction at a moment's notice. Either way, one thing is certain. This offseason is far from finished, and the next twist in this story could arrive sooner than anyone expects.